Welcome, Paul. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Ben. Quite the intro music. I appreciate that.
You deserve nothing but the best. I will leave it to you. The floor is yours.
Great. Awesome. And thanks so much for giving me the opportunity to speak today. Awesome. Let's get into it. So, hey, everyone. I'm Paul, CEO and co-founder of OnRamp. And today I'm excited to chat about how to make every customer, not just your largest or most valuable, feel like they're getting that coveted white glove treatment during the initial onboarding period. What we'll do is we'll go through why a white glove onboarding experience matters and some tips you can use to bring this to your customers at scale. All right, so we think it should be the goal of every business to give their customers a white glove onboarding experience. And we'll get to the why in a minute, but probably first good to define what that even means. It feels like a bit of a buzzword, right? But traditionally, white glove onboarding means assigning dedicated personnel on your team that helps a new customer get to clearly defined initial value. And just some characteristics of what this typically looks like. It's often marked by regular check-in meetings, and perhaps even some custom work required for your customer. It may include an SE or technical support personnel on your side, depending on your product or offering. It may be paid or it may be free, depending on your kind of go-to-market strategy and how you want to present your offerings. And what it really does is presents your onboarding team as subject matter experts and as an initial face to your relationships. So this sounds awesome, right? But why does it even matter? And then how do we do it? So that's what we'll get into. Well, the truth is, a poor onboarding experience is the #1 cause of customer churn. And we've all been there. I actually remember in a past life looking at our churn customers with my AM team at the end of a quarter, and I asked them the why question 5 times. Why they thought that customer churned, and then the why behind that answer, etc. 5 times. I think a lot of times this technique is used with children. But ultimately, what we found in about 85% of the scenarios was that the customer did not get onboarded successfully. And this was a big eye opener for me, and I expect is true for many folks out there as well. And there's a lot of advantages to building deep relationships with customers during onboarding. We can be proactive to the customer needs, of course. And really hear and understand them, right, and their business. We can identify upsell opportunities more easily. So I know a lot of times sales teams will kind of hover over the onboarding process as well, but as onboarding managers, it's really important that we can also identify opportunities to go deeper with the customer and unlock additional value, if not initially, certainly over time through that account lifecycle. And we want to make sure the qualitative matches the quantitative. We have all these great metrics to tell us how our customers are using our product quantitatively, but that really, I feel like, is only half the story. The initial usage metrics are helpful for determining activity, but you want to understand sentiment and emotion and feeling and their business objectives, right? And ultimately, people like working with other people they like and have a connection to. And this will always be true no matter how tech-enabled our world and digital our world becomes. Also worth noting here, the demographics of who buyers are is changing, and that's changing the criteria for how they think about evaluating vendors and what they're demanding from their service providers. Increasingly, millennials are getting into positions of buying power, and they are demanding more than ever from vendors and from the partnerships that they are forming with them. They can be very demanding and very opinionated, and I say that with absolute love as a fellow millennial myself. Few characteristics of them: they're digitally native, and they find it really frustrating when humans block what they believe technology should be doing. But they value your knowledge and expect your team to be consultative and likewise opinionated about their process and their business. And customers today believe they're all special and all unique and really, really, really often want you to know that. And one thing I think I've learned is to ignore that noise a little bit and realize that that is almost never true. But of course, you don't need them to know that. They're special and unique to you, as they should be. Just one interesting thing, as I was putting together this talk too, there was a recent McKinsey study I came upon that said more than 2/3 of buyers now demand a multi-channel vendor experience that gives them both what they call a remote human relationship, things like Zoom, digital communication, shared Slack channels, etc., as well as a digital self-serve experience. And a lot of the vendors we talk to, that this can seem really daunting, who they now feel like their customer experience will be even more fragmented and more disjointed, and not to mention costlier to maintain. But those who do this well will ultimately be the ones who win. And so it's important we understand this. So as much as we'd like to, we know we can't just throw people at this. Our goal in customer success is not to make our company go bankrupt, unfortunately. So oftentimes we'll try to turn to technology for this. But what we find, what's out there, is not really matching up with what customers expect and this aforementioned multi-pronged approach. We kind of find it's on either end of the spectrum, where either it's quite impersonal and doesn't really connect to the account needs and goals and context, and takes a very single player-like approach and a bit of a robotic view to things, or it oftentimes turns into an email chain and project management black box that is just asking our teams to fill out a million buttons, boxes, fields, and forms, and creating a ton of busy work along the way. Also not ideal. And what this is ultimately a continued denial of what customers today are looking for. They want to be enabled. They want to have an effortless experience in pursuit of their value. And they want to have a human connection with the companies they work with. And so these approaches oftentimes lead to low engagement and low connection, right? Certainly not what we want. Customers today, they want human connection and to be enabled to act on their own. One or the other alone isn't enough. The combo is what is the holy grail of a white glove scalable experience. Give customers everything they need in one place. Make it as easy and effortless for them as possible. Engage personally when they need you, right? When they need you, not all the time, when they need you, and be customer led. So how do we do this? Let's go through 3 pillars of this approach. First, we want to build a mutual playbook. This is a specific set of instructions that lays out a path to value that includes all the steps that need to be completed by your team and your customer. And we've come up with a framework here to help you build out your onboarding playbook. We call it the MADE framework. The M is map. Strategize and map out what needs to be done for the customer to achieve the goal of the playbook, which often means through enablement, training, rollout, and initial value. Evaluate your tasks along the way. Is the task truly a value add to the customer, or is it just busy work? Is the wording and phrasing action-oriented? Automate. Use technology to automate this busy work. You may have a bunch of permutations and combinations here from your playbooks that say, customer A bought module C, D, and B, and customer B bought X, Y, and Z, right? Make it easy to be able to spin up those customers by selecting from a menu and not having to reinvent the wheel every single time. That's not helpful. You want to delegate. Who should do what? Assign each step to the most relevant person and be really specific here. That leads to accountability. Are the right people involved on your team cross-functionally? How about on the customer's team? The common thought here is we don't want to give our customers homework or friction. But really, I take a bit of a different and nuanced view of this. Sometimes that friction can help customers find value faster and get bought in when they do it themselves. The key is just to make it as effortless as possible to complete. But it's okay to ask your customers to do things. It is okay. You should. Ease and power. How can you enable and empower the right people to act? You need to make sure each stakeholder has the right context at the right time. They only have 5 minutes a day to care about you and your product or service, so make the most of it. And before I move on, thought this would be an appropriate time to make fun of acronyms for frameworks. Hey, it works though, so we'll go with it. Pillar number 2, we can take these playbooks and turn them into dynamic action plans. A dynamic action plan is a customer-facing and customer-involved action plan following a specific set of playbooks or combination of playbooks. And good action plans have 3 characteristics. They're clear, they're actionable, and they're trackable. That sounds like another acronym that we can use. So let's do it. The CAT framework. So clear, gives succinct visual context for each step. Think of things like providing microcopy, videos, screenshots, GIFs, links, other embeds, these little bite-sized pieces that provide important context and mini training along the way. Don't just hand them a knowledge base with a million articles. They're not going to read it, I promise you. We want to make it actionable. Make it as easy and effortless as possible to complete steps along the journey here. Think of things like embedding forms and links directly in presentations, enabling third-party action, bringing that into one place, enabling forms and surveys in one place, right? That is actionable and that's centralized. And then, of course, trackable. We want to add tracking and reporting for step completion. Make it easy for your customer to say, we know exactly where we are, where we stand, and what needs to happen next. Send a weekly summary at the end of the week of the progress that was made and what we need to do next, right? And what's on deck for next week. Oftentimes, the buyer is not the same person who you're going to be working with for a rollout. So it's important that that decision maker stays involved and stays engaged and stays in the loop. This can often not happen. And you can't improve on what you don't measure, so it's critical you have benchmarks and are constantly measuring the effects of changes and updates to process and team. We, of course, need to measure efficiency here. You really do need to treat this as a conveyor belt, right? You need to track key outcomes. And a best practice here is to make your playbook category headings actual outcomes the customer wants to achieve, so that when they're going through those tasks, it's all in service of an actual outcome, right? Those tedious things that we might be doing along the way feel much better when they're in pursuit of something greater. And here's the thing, you want to be checking in on the experience, not 3 weeks post onboarding when everyone has moved on. That would have recency bias if they ran into a bug that they're particularly frustrated with, right? We've all been there. But real time in quick hits. Understand what was easy or hard, or where bottlenecks exist. And you'll take this information and you'll feed it back into an improved playbooks. Playbooks are not static. They're ever changing with your process, with your team, with your product, right? This is a living, breathing organism. And I think that's important to remember. That's the 3 pillars there. Just a last little plug here. OnRamp, the company that I founded, has created the first software for white glove customer onboarding experiences that you can deliver to your customers at scale. And if you're interested in learning more here, check us out, onramp.us. And if you mention that you were part of this re-up talk, you'll get 2 months free on a plan. So hopefully we'll be able to chat with you further about this. Thank you.
Awesome, Paul. That was fantastic. And we have some great questions from the audience I want to make sure we get to. The most upvoted one so far. So reminder to the audience, if you're new joining us, make sure you go to that questions tab, upvote your favorites, submit things that you want to know. I see from the poll, which Paul, I'll share with you as well, vast majority of our audience is either yes or sort of responsible for onboarding. I always love this sort of ... question mark. I should end all my sentences that way. So very relevant for this audience, some great questions from them. Number one is, how do you deal with customers who don't want to have a scaled onboarding experience?
So those that would want a truly a white glove approach, I think the key is nobody wants to be doing busy work. Nobody wants to be tracking, tasks and to-dos and dates and all of that. I think you can still provide an experience that is scaled, but still feels very personal. The answer is not just to hand someone a checklist and say, go for it. The answer is to say, we're going to take all the scheduling and all the busy work out of your plate and talk more deeply about you and your needs and your experience to help. Ultimately, that's what people want at the end of the day, right? They want to achieve their business outcomes and hit their own objectives. So I don't view that as like a 0 or 1, right?
I think it's a great point. And I think going back to the point you were making, it's about coaching them on why that's better and leading them to that conclusion. You don't want to necessarily say like, hey, this is going to be a better experience for you, but you sort of want to say like, here's this more convenient option. I don't want to waste your time. I want to make the most out of your time. They're not going to argue with that and be like, no, please waste my time. So as long as it's presented in the right way, where it's like, hey, this is less work for our CS team, but it's hey, we have this new way that'll save you time, be more convenient. You can access it whenever, work your own hours. You know what I mean? Like that's a good way to get buy-in.
And even if it's like, hey, we still, what they expect is they want to do a check-in with us every week, to track progress, great. But maybe that becomes a half hour instead of an hour. That's a huge, multiply about the number of customers that you have that fit that category. Every minute matters, right? We're all busy in our days, right? So that, exactly. I think that's right.
That's a great point. And we're getting a lot of good questions in. So up next is, how do you deal with customers that are all excited about onboarding, but then they sort of ghost you or become disengaged? Like that would ever happen.
No, that never happens. I really
Never
view
happened.
that. Yeah, a lot of times I view that as really, we need to do a better job in the sales process, right? Like a lot of times I think I like bringing the onboarding team into the final stages of the sales process to clearly outline the expectations and start to get the wheels turning. You can do that without a ton of time and effort and feel like, oh, we're treating a customer who isn't even paying us yet, right? So I think if you set all that action plan up front and make that very clear, you're going to find that that seamlessly rolls into the post-sale experience, and your customer is much less likely to ghost you. You want them to buy into that in the sales process. If they do, I think you're going to have a winning strategy.
I think that's a great point. And Adrian, just on your comment in the chat, I do apologize. I and several of our speakers speak at very rapid paces, but all the recordings will be made available to everyone on the call afterwards. So you'll be able to take all the notes you want, slow us down into slow motion, and and watch your own pace. Scaled conference viewing. What would be the first thing you would focus on scaling if you would like to begin scaling onboarding? So I guess if you're currently doing this sort of like one-to-one white glove, old version of white glove motion, where it's, me, Ben, onboarding you, synchronous calls, all that kind of stuff, where would you start to get this going?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to plug our product a little bit perhaps, but I would use some technology here to help out, because a lot of times teams start with laying all this out in slides or really lengthy email chains or other like super manual ways of doing it. And I think the first thing is to ask yourself, okay, how can we easily create a new customer and get them on the conveyor belt, right? So something like OnRamp would help with that. But even having a Notion page, even if it's public, right, that outlines that you don't have to do every time, helps to say, okay, new customer, here's how we're going to go through this process together. That's way better than like copying and pasting in Excel and trying to redo all the dates and all the to-dos, right? Like that's a great place to start, in my opinion.
100%. I mean, there's a big debate. I'm curious where our audience lands on this as well, between, when it comes to whether you're buying software, like, do you have to figure everything out before you buy the software, or do you buy the software to give yourself some of that structure so that you can build things out properly? I can see arguments for both, but I think in this case, it does make a lot of sense, because what I've seen happen so many times with this use case and others is you build out the beautiful slides, you spend all this time building out your Google Sheet, you build out whatever, all this stuff, and then it just lives and dies in Google Drive.
Yeah.
Right? Because if you don't have a way to actually turn something into action, it's just gonna drop and live and die in Google Drive. So I think you make a great point, and there's a reason that you guys exist as a company. So
yes, the dreaded Google Drive. You look at the activity on it and it's like just you going in there, and the customer visited on kickoff and then never again. Yeah, I mean, we've all been there. Exactly.
100%. We're getting more burning questions. This is great. How do you keep processes consistent and protect your central onboarding process from getting changed by each CSM over time? Ooh, I love that, because that's a big debate in CS, because every CSM has their own flair and their own little, twist on how they like to do things, the Paul way versus the Ben way. So what are your thoughts on that when it comes to onboarding?
Yeah, and listen, you want to give people, you hired people, good people, right, who have their own personality, and the goal here is to create a relationship with the customer. Some people may do things slightly differently. You need to be okay with that, right? We aren't robots, right? But I think this is where the playbook concept comes into play. You need to centralize that and have that accessible and say, this is the starting point for everything that we do. Now, you may take this and you may tweak this a little bit, but ultimately, this is what we expect. These are the key points, because we know this works. And so you can dance around it and you can put your own little flair in it, but this is what we expect. And as that updates, you need to constantly relay to your team, hey, we made updates here. Here are the changes. That needs to be a direct line of communication from management back to CSMs to stay on the same page. You can also do things, of course, like doing training in the interim and have them role play with you over time if you find that's a big issue. But I think simply a lot of times, again, we talk about the slide share or the slides issue. A lot of times there's 20 different versions. How does any CSM, CSMs have taken it and now, for lack of a better term, bastardized it and just continued to copy and paste it. And yeah, of course, everyone's doing different things, right? Because it's all over the place. So you need one central place to put that, right? And that'll really help.
I think it makes a lot of sense. And it's like, as with anything where this question comes up, if it's onboarding, if it's renewals, if it's upsells, like, even with sales teams, like no sales team, no AEs rarely sell like the exact same way, but you still need to know those checkpoints that you need to hit, the milestones you need to hit. And yeah, it's your choice if you choose route A, B, or C, but you know that they need to get from A to B to C, especially with onboarding. So I think that makes a lot of sense. We have a few more questions here, so excuse the fast talking, but I want to get to everything the audience wants to know about. How does the CS team, or how does customer success create a menu of options without limiting your sales team?
Say that question one more time.
So how does customer success create a menu of options without limiting your sales team? So my interpretation would be, instead of the sales team just talking about white glove onboarding as this, like, we have the best onboarding in the business, we'll get you up and running in 30 days, blah, blah, blah. To, well, you can choose, this one, or this comes with white glove, which is this amount versus this, if you're charging for onboarding, for example. That one's anonymous, so I can't call a person out to explain, but.
Yeah, no, for sure. Well, listen, I think in general, the dynamic is you need to be training your sales team on how to talk about you and your team, and you need to be doing that consistently. And so the answer isn't to say, hey, we're going to let our sales team run amok and say, hey, we can do whatever you want. It's white glove, right? You need, by using a dynamic action plan and a tool like OnRamp, wink, wink, that can point to a very specific way of doing. You can say, this is our framework. We've done this a million times. We've onboarded customers like you a million times. Here's how it works. Put those guardrails in place and have that be presented as part of the sales collateral and process. And I think if you do that, you'll really kind of keep the sales team on the straight and narrow. If you find that's not happening, that just needs to be communicated internally, in my opinion. And yeah, for example, at Troops where I was in the past, I would basically once a month with new salespeople go through how to talk about customer success and customer onboarding and kind of get them trained up on that. That was invaluable, right? Just it helped make sure that I knew what was coming in, the expectations were set appropriately, and I wasn't set up for failure, right?
100%. And I think what you touched on there that really jumped out at me, that has worked in the past. Like, I used to work at a health tech company where all my customers were surgeons, like heart surgeons, brain surgeons, spine surgeons, people way smarter than me. And so when I'd be having that initial conversation with them on the CS side, they like to tell me how to do my job, or like, this is what we need, and we're really whatever. And so, what always worked was just coming back to the data, like you said, because everyone wants to be successful. But if you can say, hey, I've implemented 30 customers, this is what works, this is what doesn't work, so this is what I want to do with you because you're so smart and brilliant and should be really successful. And, play into it from that side. And, it tends to work, because you can argue with, if you leave it up to them, they'll ask for the world. And, so I think it's really important to have those data points to always fall back on, because it's so much harder to argue with. And people feel like you're making the decision because it's the best one for them, not just because you're lazy or whatever the company doesn't want to do it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
We have time for, I think, one, maybe two more questions. So are there any tips or suggestions to scale white glove service to customers post onboarding?
That's really interesting. Yeah, post onboarding. I think when you think about post onboarding, you really want to think about, a lot of times when you view onboarding as this one homogenous pillar and project, the truth is the best plans are laid out in more of a stepwise, step up approach. And so what I really tell teams to do oftentimes, they try to shove way too much in onboarding and let's get everything set up and get you going with everything. And like, oh, let me just spill my knowledge to you. And I know this will be successful for you because I've done this a million times. Your customer is like, take a breath, like, hold on, let's start. Like, we're just getting this implemented. It's change management. Let's not try to do too much too quickly. So a lot of times what I try to do is to have people actually break up their onboarding and implementation into 2 or 3 different phases, particularly if you have a particularly technical or increasingly complex product. And so again, just immediately post onboarding, we talk about, and that's a great way to continue to build the relationship and continue to add value, right? You don't want to show all your cards immediately. You want to, over time, be able to say, we're going to continue to add value to you. And so anyway, hopefully there's obviously post that, but like that's a tip that a trick that I use, often.
I mean, it reminds me of Jose's talk from earlier this morning, speaking about, when you're evaluating software, make sure you know the three things that you actually need to do.
Yeah.
And like how that software accomplishes that, because then if you translate that into onboarding, it simplifies, it does what you're talking about, which is like, don't onboard them and show them everything all at once, because they'll get overwhelmed.
They won't remember. I promise. Yeah.
And they won't remember. Exactly. So figuring out, and that's where that sales CS handoff comes in and all these other things, but figuring out, what point, what are the three things that matter? And then how can we customize their scaled onboarding experience so that, and that'll feel even more white glove, right? You told us these three things are most important to you. Here's exactly where you're going to learn how to do ABC. Here's the resources available, and you go from there.
And then what's cool about it is, you take them from a beginner to intermediate to pro, right? And people feel really good when they, when they have that type of experience, right? And they really like that kind of approach. Yeah.
100%. I think we're having a slight technical issue, so I'm going to go with one more question, since there are more questions in the thing from the audience. So thoughts, this is from Steve, thoughts on executive sponsor or eco buyer being present in onboarding kickoff for partnership alignment. Is that something that you advise your customers to do?
Yeah, kickoff for sure. And I think a lot of people then kind of forget about them because they're not the ones kind of running this project data. We can't forget about them. It's really important that they stay. I promise you, they're asking the team that they asked to like run this, where are we at with this? Why isn't it going live? What's happening? You need an easy way to have a shared language to say, let me give that. You should help your customer, right? You'll make your customer look really good by giving them that information. But I think in the kickoff, 100% makes sense to be there, particularly if you're confirming business objectives and goals. Like that's really, really important. So yes, highly recommend it.
Awesome. Great question, Steve. Great spot to end it on. Paul, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Appreciate it.